Hi everyone. Earlier in this series on the London system, I mentioned that world champion Magnus Carlsen has been playing the London in recent years, and he sparked an interest amongst amateur players. So let's have a look at one of his games. So this game is from 2020, and it was against Liren, who had the black pieces. So it was a rapid game, and it opened with d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, bishop f4. So Carlsen puts his bishop on f4 on the third move rather than the second move, and this is a pretty common move order as well. Black goes for an early c5. We talked about this plan before. And Carlsen tries e3. He's not worried about the queen coming to the b6 square and attacking this pawn because of the typical defense knight to c3. And that makes the pawn on b2 poisoned, because if black takes it, there's knight to b5, and black's in a lot of trouble. He has to defend the c7 square. His queen might get trapped. Here's a sample line. Knight to a6 to defend c7. a3 to protect the b4 square from the queen and maybe trapping the queen soon. Bishop to f5, hitting c2 so the queen doesn't get trapped. It can take on c2. D takes c5, queen takes c2, trade of queens, rook c1, kicking the bishop back, and then knight b d4. And white has a lot of threats in the position. He's threatening the bishop on f5. He's threatening to push his c-pawn here because the b-pawn can't take without the bishop winning the knight on a6, or maybe even capturing the knight first and getting rid of that b-pawn and then trying to promote his c-pawn. And black's king is still in the center of the board. So white's dominating. Here's a sample. Bishop d7. That just drops a piece to c6. For example, if bishop takes c6, then knight takes the bishop and draws the defender away from the a6 knight, and white takes the piece. Okay, so that pawn is poisoned after knight to c3. All right, so Liren didn't go for queen b6, he tried e6. Then c3, completing the triangle here in the London system. Bishop d6, and now we've seen this situation before with these dark squared bishops facing each other, and I mentioned how you should play bishop to g3 there, so that if black takes the bishop, you can take back with the h-pawn and have an open h-file for your rook, and that's a popular way to do it. But after watching this game, I realized that white has another option. Carlsen just ignored the threat on his bishop on f4, and Liren didn't take it. If he had taken it, white would have been okay. Even after queen c7 attacking the f4 pawn, white can defend it, and this pawn structure is fine for white. The bishop can go to g2 and protect these light squares, and white's doing fine. And he's got an excellent grip on this important e5 square in the center as well. All right, so that's another option to think about sometimes, leaving that bishop on f4. Okay, so after knight b d2, c takes d4, and now Carlsen sacrifices a pawn in a very interesting way. He plays bishop takes d6, and that allows black to counterattack the knight on d2, winning a pawn. And Carlsen just saves his bishop, gives up the knight, and then takes on d2. So white's down a pawn in the position, but look at this bishop on a3. It's keeping black from castling. It's a very powerful piece. So let's see what black does about that. Knight c6, queen g5, excellent move, hitting this sensitive square on g7. There's only two ways to defend it: push it forward and get a bunch of weak dark squares, or do what Liren tried, rook g8. Bishop d3, getting ready to castle. h6, driving the queen back. Queen b6, offering a trade of queens, but Carlsen doesn't want that. He's a pawn down. He wants to continue attacking, so he drops the queen back. Bishop d7. And all of a sudden, black is actually ready to castle queenside. So he's going to get his king out of the center. Okay, white castles, black castles. And now white has a very good plan here. He plays b4, and the intent is to play b5 and dislodge that knight. That knight is currently defending the e5 square, so if Carlsen can drive that knight away, then he can sink his own knight into that great square, and it's a lot closer to that black king and can participate in an attack. Not to mention the f7 pawn is weak right now, and black can't even defend it with a rook because of the bishop on a3. So he'd have to defend it with this bishop by dropping it back. Okay. So black just moves the king over to maybe a safer square there. And I'll point out it doesn't really do any good to try to stop b5 by playing a6, because white can play b5 anyway, and then a takes b5, bishop takes b5, and white is still threatening to remove the defender of the e5 square. And the b file is now open for a rook, and the queen is sitting there, so that's just a worse position for black. So he just moves the king over and allows b5 to come. The knight goes to a5, and then Carlsen does sink his knight into the e5 square. Okay, bishop e8, the only way to defend f7, and then bishop b4. So that bishop is very nice on b4. It protects this c3 pawn, which was previously undefended. There may be a rook coming to c8 to attack it soon. It also puts pressure on this knight and keeps the queen tied down. So let's see what black does. Rook c8, a4, just taking time to protect the b5 pawn further and making this bishop look pretty silly on this diagonal. In fact, if you look at all of black's pieces, you'll find out that they don't have many squares. White controls all the important squares in the position, and black is really hurting to even find any plan at all to unravel his pieces. And I think because of that, Liren blundered here with knight e4. Maybe that's a blunder, or maybe he's purposely giving a pawn back, but Carlsen takes the free pawn on e4. And then Liren plays f6, trying to drive the knight off, maybe get the bishop into the game on this diagonal. But there's a very powerful move in the position, and Carlsen finds it. Queen to h7, attacking the rook on g8. There's nowhere for the rook to run to, and defending it with the bishop doesn't work for two reasons. One, we can take the bishop, and two, we can get a royal fork here. Okay, so that bishop, keep in mind that bishop has to protect against a royal fork in the coming moves. So black looks like he's busted, but he has one last try. He can counterattack white's rook on a8. All right, well, white takes the rook on g8, black takes the rook on a1, and now Carlsen plays the game-ending move. See if you can guess what Carlsen played that forced Liren to resign. Okay, there's more than one winning move in the position, but Carlsen played queen takes bishop. Remember that bishop was defending the d7 square against a royal fork. So the rook can't take the queen without facing knight to d7, going up a lot of material. Now, Liren could have actually played on. Checking the engine, though, it says the score is plus 4.2 in Carlsen's favor, but he could have tried taking the knight on e5, and then white would have to save the queen. But all of black's pawns start to fall quickly, and right now there is a threat in the position of bishop to d6 check. So black moves the rook over, white could take the g-pawn, still threatening a couple other pawns in the position. Maybe black saves his knight right now, but then queen takes e5 check, queen c7 blocking, queen takes e6, and we can see why black resigned. All right, so I learned a couple of new things about the London system by watching the World Champion. I hope you did too. Thanks for watching.